Welcome to the From Lab to Patient, Garage to Market podcast with your host, Phil Crowley. In each episode, we will discuss professionals serving the tech startup market and the various issues of importance to those companies. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, CrowleyLawLLC.com. Now here's the host of From Lab to Patient, Garage to Market, Phil Crowley.
Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for tuning into our webcast. You know, we try to bring you experts in the startup and technology world who can demystify the process of getting your products out to the market, things to do, mistakes to avoid, and the context of actually bringing technology to enrich the lives of thousands or even millions of people. And today, I'm delighted to have with me my good friend, Chris Frank. Chris is the Chief Client Officer at PSB Insights. That's a global leader in market research and consulting. And Chris is a real expert. His expertise has been focused on Harvard Business Review, Fortune Magazine, TEDx, and Fast Company. And he's the author of two highly acclaimed books, Drinking from the Fire Hose and Decisions Over Decimals. So I'd have to say that Chris is a master at turning data into actionable strategies that can lead to success and drive a business. And that, I think, is particularly relevant for our digital companies and digital entrepreneurs out there in the audience. Chris, welcome.
Hey, Phil. So good to see you. Happy New Year.
Well, same to you. Well, Chris, could you explain to my audience a little bit about your background and experience? You've had quite a distinguished career in marketing and interpreting data.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So first of all, I'm just thrilled to be on the podcast today. My background actually starts, I went to a leading engineering institution, technology, in its DNA, Stevens Institute. And shameless plug for Stevens, that it is a institution that really teaches one how to critically think. Interestingly, Phil, I didn't go there for engineering. I really focused on what is called technology management. And in the most practical terms, how do you bridge and play that connector between data, information, technology, and business needs, business outcomes, business strategy? So that is from a formal education. That's where a lot of my initial ideas were grounded. I started two companies. One was a financial success, and the second one was a critical success. And that's another nice way of saying a financial disaster. But I could tell you, I learned the most from that critical success startup, because that's actually how I got my start in data and analytics and using information to make smarter decisions.
It's very interesting that you say that, Chris, because sometimes, entrepreneurs with whom I've spoken say that they sometimes learn more from their, as you refer to it as a critical success, than they do from their actual successes. Because when everything goes right, you just assume that you're brilliant and everything has come together. Whereas when things don't work out right, particularly from your perspective, being very analytical about things, you kind of wonder what you could have done, should have done to make things better.
Right. And I did learn a lot from that process. And as I was building my go-to-market plans, as I was building the technology roadmap, as I was concurrently also putting together a marketing strategy. I mean, as you know, being a founder, an entrepreneur, you wear many hats. And one thing that I realized as I was building the strategy, I started to make all these forecasts and projections based on readily available data. And when your own money is on the line, when you are trying to bring a product or a market to life, a business to life, to market, you start to interrogate the information and the data in a very different way. And as I was interrogating the information, I started to find out it was built on so many caveats, and there was not a lot of rich thinking behind it. And it gave me pause, Phil. And I said, if I'm supposed to make data informed decisions, I need to become better at understanding how to use data, because data in itself will not make a decision for you. There's that old cliche, Phil, what gets measured gets done.
Mhm.
It feels like everything is measured today and less is getting done.
Well, I mean, I think that your focus on the sources of data is really quite instructive because of what we've seen with inaccurate data on the internet and on public sources, and then the inaccurate answers we can get, and fascination that comes out of artificial intelligence engines. And if it's not viewed critically through some vetting process, you can go completely overboard on the wrong assumptions.
Yeah, I love that you use the word critically. One thing, so I've been studying decision making for 10 years, and I've been in data and analytics and insights for well over 25 years. Started out in the technology industry at Microsoft, then I worked for American Express for 15 years. And now in my current role at PSB, I am focused on helping and enabling our clients to make better decisions with data. And that critical component, everyone is like, I hear a lot about critical thinking, but I'm not a data scientist. How do you think critically about data and information? And I'm going to share with you, Phil, something I call the context triangle.
Uh-huh.
Whenever you receive a data point, a number, whatever that may be, you should look at it from three different views. One, look at it in absolute. In absolute, is that number big enough or small enough to even matter to you?
Mm-hmm.
The second leg of kind of the triangle is look at it over time. Has it changed, and is that change real, or is it just noise?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third leg of the triangle is look at it relative to some benchmark, whether it's an industry benchmark, a competitive benchmark, some kind of norm. So you should never look at a data point in a vacuum. Data should always be in context. If you do that, you will start to move down the path of being a critical thinker around data.
So it seems like that is really the skill set that entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs who are focused on data to make business decisions, need to focus on. And it leads to a question of, we've got so much data out there. Why is it so difficult for people to make decisions with all that data, even with the template the context that you've provided us? I call it the ATB triangle: absolute, time related, benchmark related, and industry related template. Why is it so difficult?
Yeah, because couple of reasons. First of all, decisions represent change, and people are not wired for change. As humans, as individuals, change represents a deviation from what you know, or your habit, or the way your company has done something. And when you're asked to make a decision, even you may have all the data, we're not wired for change, and people fear change. What happens if I'm wrong? Can I, reverse this decision? So, fundamentally, at our core, we need to recognize that, number one, Phil. The second thing is, even though we have data, people actually fall into two camps. They're either data driven, or what we call intuitive, an intuitive decision maker. So you're either a data decision maker or an intuitive decision maker. And excuse me. And going to the extreme on either or doesn't lead to confidence in making a great decision, because you get into analysis paralysis. If you are a data-driven decision maker, give me more information. You get into, what I call, the 0.3 decimal point issue. If you take that to the third decimal point, is this still true? You're never going to make a decision.
Right.
If you're an intuitive decision maker, oh, I just feel it, that isn't, this recipe for a decision. So, people have to, first of all, recognize that successful decision makers marry both. It's the intersection of what we call data and intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing that I would say, Phil, is too many people focus on what they call framing the problem versus framing the outcome. Actually define, what does success look like? What does excellence look like? People talk about growth versus winning. I'm going to build this company, I'm going to enter this market, I'm going to target this customer base, and I want to grow. Well, how do they actually define growth? Versus winning, growth may be, I want to grow 20% this year. If you frame your outcome as winning, that I want to grow 60% this year, it's going to change your whole mindset in terms of how you approach a decision, what data you need, what experience or intuition you want. And you may not get to that 60%, Phil, but it'll set you up for success to get closer to that 20%.
So in other words, it's a stretch goal that leads you to achieve more than you thought you could, even if you don't reach it. It's like kind of aiming for the stars and then winding up on Mars. But, you're still quite a far away from where you started.
Right. But when you do that, how you view the data that you need and view your whole decision process will actually change, because a lot of data that we receive is very short term. It's very transactional. And if you use short-term data, transactional information to inform your long-term strategy, there is a disconnect between that. And that will always, not give you confidence to make you feel, hey, I'm trying to decide where I'm going in 2 years, or should I do this investment, or should I enter this market, or should I enter into this partnership with this potential, supplier. And if you're basing that on short-term data, you're always going to have this dissonance between the data you have and the decision and outcome you're seeking.
Actually, how do you discipline yourself to try to find long-term data? And what does that look like? Because it sounds like it's more difficult to get the long-term data than the short-term transactional data.
Yeah, so there's a couple of techniques. Something that I think is a very powerful technique is what I call IWIK. I wish I knew. It is a 4-word question. And when you are faced with making a decision, ask yourself, what do you wish you knew? I call it the impossible dream question, Phil, because I want to remove all biases, all assumptions. Don't assume that you have any data in front of you. In a perfect world, what do you wish you knew? And the answer to that is a series of, I wish I knew this. I wish I knew, that data point. I wish I understood this about this customer. I wish I knew why, this competitor versus, that partner, how they're doing. You wind up with a series of statements that start to almost act as a governor or a regulator on your data flow. And that'll start to point you to, instead of drinking from, pardon the expression, drinking from the fire hose of data, it will enable you to say, you know what? I just don't want data on this market or on this specific customer. I need a very specific data point. And then now I've become much more comfortable and focused. That will enable me, if I get that data, to have more confidence in making that decision.
Well, it sounds like you need to be thoughtful about that. And it sounds like having discussions with your group and with people outside perhaps your company, but who are in the same industry would be an important part of being able to have that broader perspective on what data points are out there and what are the things that I wish I knew.
Yeah, that broad perspective is essential. It almost goes back to what we talked about earlier, the context triangle. When I talked about a benchmark or a competitor, that could be outside your industry. You may be looking at a very targeted market, but you are going to learn and get a broader perspective by looking at, an adjacent market that you could learn from, or will say, you know what, this number has potential to be this over X period. So I think that looking outside your traditional market really challenges your thinking on the data you need and also the type of decision or the outcome that you could potentially achieve.
All right, I want to follow up on that and get you to think about an example of that you can share with the audience. In the meantime, I'd like to explain a little bit about Crowley Law. We are a boutique law firm of very experienced lawyers who are passionate about helping life sciences and other technology entrepreneurs realize their dreams, to take great ideas from the laboratory bench to the patient's bedside, or from the garage to the marketplace to enrich the lives and well-being of thousands or even millions of people. I'm a former research physicist. I did my work in superconductivity and materials research. And so I know and have experienced how difficult it is to create new knowledge. So I have a tender spot in my heart for the innovators out there who are trying to do new things. And as a experienced corporate lawyer, I know how difficult it is to take even great ideas from the lab to the marketplace. And we are really focused on helping founders avoid legal mistakes that can get in the way of their being successful and then being taken advantage of by experienced angel investors or venture capitalists. We've got a website, Crowley Law LLC.com, with a host of resources for your use, and I recommend those to you. We also have an ebook out there, The Top 10 Causes of Failure for Technology Startups and How to Avoid Them. I recommend that to your attention, and some other materials. And if you're working on a project, an idea about which you're really passionate and interested in moving forward, we'd really love you to contact us. info@crowleylawllc.com. We'd love to talk to you about your innovation. And just remember, we're here to help. All right, Chris, with that opportunity, I'd really like you to give us put some flesh on the bones of the ATR triangle, and how you can look at a parallel kind of business and industry and then apply it to your particular industry.
Right. So I did think of an example to kind of bring this to life. So I was working with a general manager in a market, and we were doing a regular readout of a data report. And we had a few minutes afterwards, and he said to me, anything you didn't understand in the data, anything that was unexpected or a surprise? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, actually, there was. And Phil, I know you've been around using data and information for years. When we have a data point that doesn't necessarily conform to the overall narrative, or it just doesn't look right, where do we put it? Where does it go in the report?
It's going down at the end, or it's going to be omitted.
Exactly. Typically it's, at the end, buried in the appendix. and we call it an outlier.
Right.
So as a market research or insight professional, in my 65-page deck of 8-point font of numbers, and 8-point font does exist, Phil. I worked at Microsoft. We've used it. When this GM asked me anything you didn't understand, I went to the back of the appendix, and I think page 57 or whatever it was deep in there.
Mhm.
And I was like, there were several districts in your market that didn't align with how everyone else did. He's like, what were they? And I read them off one by one by one. There's, I don't know, 5, 6 of them. And interestingly, he leaned over to his chief of staff and they started doing check marks. Now, all the district leads were in this room. Like I said, we did this is a quarterly review on how the business was doing. And you almost felt the entire room like lean in. And he's like, interesting. And now all the district GMs are looking at me going, you just called out my district. Why did he say interesting? And here's the punchline, Phil. In each one of these districts, the client satisfaction was up double digits, whereas in the broader market, it was about single digits, 4 or 5%. In each of these markets that I called out, it was 12, 14, 15%, quarter over quarter. Mm-hmm. So he's like, we ran a pilot. We didn't tell anyone. But I committed that as soon as one of our customers called us, I would have someone there physically on-site support by the end of the day. And I wanted to see if that made a difference in our relationship and partnership, obviously long-term business with them. Mm-hmm. And he did it randomly to have a true test. And he didn't tell anyone because he didn't want to bias the results.
Right.
And in each one of those markets where he did that investment, they were up 2 to 3x. So all of a sudden, there's an example of context. What I reported out, yeah, everything's looking good. What I call the sea of green. We're up 4 or 5%. Everyone's happy. Right. What I meant, and then all of a sudden, I gave context to what was possible. Well, your benchmark in this case was other districts. They were up 12, 15%.
Right.
All of a sudden, that 5% did not look great. In that meeting, based on that test, he funded what he called a rapid on-site support program, and it lived for many years. Mm-hmm. And guess what, Phil? I buried that information because it was an outlier, because it didn't follow the data pattern. It was buried in the back of the deck. Right. And unless he asked that question, was there anything unexpected in the data set? Was there anything that surprised you? We would have missed that. So all of a sudden, I'm bringing together a couple concepts, Phil. One, the triangle. The absolute number was 5%. The benchmark or the competitive norm, or the potential was around 15%. And then I had it over time. I could compare what each district did relative to where this investment was made.
Right.
And that leads us to, I think, another really powerful technique. IWIK was 4 words. I wish I knew. This one is what surprised you.
Right.
If you want to change the dialogue with your team, with your customers, with your partners, ask what surprised you, because it is a bias killer. It helps people think differently, and it gives permission for people to think differently. So I think the question, what surprised you, is one of the most powerful questions you could ask, and it is deceptively simple.
That certainly is, and it reminds me of a quote that I know you really enjoy, which is that the smartest person in the room is the one who asks the most questions. And it was the fact that the supervisor was able to ask those questions and get people to change their frame of reference in terms of thinking about what the data was saying, that really resulted in an opportunity for dramatic gains. And I wonder how many of our innovators out there have the same sort of opportunities if they would just take it.
Yeah, the one, I'm glad you raised that quote. I think one of the most powerful skills you could build is the ability to ask questions. And that case study example I just gave you, you don't need to be a data scientist. You don't need to know how to run, regressions and turf analysis. Just by asking the right questions, you could spark a different line of thinking. I'm a big fan of asking questions. And when I talk about becoming a fierce interrogator of data, people at first think it's like, oh, I need to know how to do pivot tables and SPSS and do Python. Could not be further from the truth. As a founder, as an innovator, one of the most powerful skills you could bring is the ability to ask questions.
Fascinating. It brings us around to, in terms of that continuing work on improvement about brand building. How does data analysis contribute to that?
Yeah. So I worked in my 25 years in corporate as a corporate researcher. I lived in the marketing and brand space, and I worked with a lot of creative people, including our agency partners. And marketing and brand building have really evolved. A term you may hear, or if you could look up, MarTech. How do you integrate marketing and technology? Because they are one today. If you're doing, SEO, search engine optimization, you're buying display ads, building a brand, is essential in terms of it provides a shorthand. I guess what's the best word? A brand is a promise. A brand is a promise to your employees, to your customers, to your clients. And you need to monitor and measure that brand on a regular basis. So, the intersection around brand building is one, really understand what makes you unique, superior, and ownable. And those three things matter. What I mean by that, when you think around a brand, when I say unique, you could be different than everyone else. And you have to some point of differentiation. Different doesn't necessarily mean you're better. That's the second part, superior. You want to be different and superior. And the third thing is ownable. When you build your brand, if you do something or you put out a product or a service, and it can be easily replicated by a competitor or someone that's bigger, that ownable part is essential. So when you think around brand building, think around superior, distinct, and ownable. And then your measurement system should really link and label to those. So you need to so then on an ongoing basis, as you do your marketing, as you do your promotions, as you do your offers or experiences, what of those three elements is it hitting on? And you don't always have to hit on all three consistently. Brand building, this promise, happens over time. And you need a measurement system that informs and enables you to almost tune your actions over time.
Now, does that integrate with the Net Promoter Score kind of measurement systems? And for those of our audience who are not familiar with that, it's either a 5-point or a 10-point scale where you take the proportion of respondents who rate you 8, 9, or 10, minus the proportion of respondents who rate you 6 or less. And companies like Apple and the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain rate extremely high on that. And other companies use that as a measure of how well they're doing. So I would recommend to you that you go out to the internet and take a look at Net Promoter Scores and consider that, using that in connection with your own marketing. But please go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's a great build because, and the question behind the Net Promoter Score, the scale you just shared, Phil, is how likely would you be to recommend blank, whatever that blank is, your company, your product, your service.
Right.
And
well, Chris, I'm sorry, please go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, the power of the Net Promoter Score is twofold. One, it's simplicity. It is one question, and everyone can get their head around one question.
Right.
So, there's beauty in the simplicity. And when you think around measurement, keep that point in mind. The simpler your measurement system, the more likely you are to easier to implement, easier for people to understand, and easier to action. The second, the second point of Net Promoter Score is it gives you a benchmark. There's a lot of Net Promoter Scores, as you said. If you go out there, there's different norms, there's different standards. So it is simple, it is clear. I'm going to share, and you're already going to get this from Crowley Law podcast. I'm going to share a test that I ran several years ago on Net Promoter Score. And I modified the question. Instead of saying, how likely would you be to recommend the product, I modified it and ran a test to say, did you recommend the product? The gap between likely versus did you. So what that small change did, and this is what I'm doing, and the team at PSB Insights are doing, is really trying to understand not only customer and client intent, but behavior. So that small modification to the Net Promoter Score, how likely would you versus did you? I think both of those are essential to understand because we all have good intentions, but what founders, what innovators need is they need action. They need someone to actually, recommend their product, recommend their service.
Fascinating. Well, it reminds me of some books that I will recommend to our listeners by Robert Cialdini, who is the professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Arizona. Persuasion, a really brilliant book about psychology. The time has really gotten away from us, Chris. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that this has been a benefit to our listeners and our viewers. Please subscribe to the podcast, like the podcast, and visit our website at crowleylawllc.com. Just remember, we're here to help you.
You've been tuning into the From Lab to Patient, Garage to Market podcast with your host, Phil Crowley. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, crowleylawllc.com. If you found this information helpful, please subscribe, like, leave a positive review, and share with others.